One of the most common execution methods used throughout history saw thousands of people who had been condemned being taken to the gallows all across the world. Inside towns and cities there were permanent sets of gallows that acted as a reminder of the king or queen's justice, and anyone who dared to commit serious crimes knew that they could be taken to the gallows for their death. There were different variations of execution on the gallows, as people could be executed using the long drop, the standard drop, or the short drop. But inside of certain countries and nations, there was a very different version of hanging that did not even use the gallows, but instead utilised a pole or a post. This was used for some very prominent executions at the end of the Second World War, but it had been around for centuries. Welcome to the Fortress. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Pole hanging was a variation of the short drop method of execution, and it emerged inside of different lands in Europe, including Austro-Hungary. It utilised a post or a pole for the execution, and it had a number of steps in which someone would be executed on the pole. The term for it, vergelegen, translates into English as a strangling gallows, and it was, when performed in public, rather brutal. It had a number of steps. Firstly, the condemned was brought to the vertical post or pillar for their execution. This was roughly 3 meters tall. Then a rope would be attached around the feet of the condemned, and it was secured through a pulley system found at the bottom of the pole. Then the condemned were thrust into the air to the top of the pole by a sling, which ran across their chest under their arms, and then the noose was tied around the prisoner's neck. This noose was then secured to a hook on top of the pole. The chest sling held the condemned in place, but when the sling was released, the victim jerked downwards, and the assistant, using a foot rope, guided this. The executioner was stood on a platform behind or next to the condemned, and he placed the heel of his hand under the jaw of the prisoner, and this made the force on the neck greater at the end of the drop, and the executioner then manually dislocated the neck of the condemned by forcing the head to one side. A 19th century Austrian hangman claimed that this was more humane than using the standard drop and a gallows. The reason behind this was that the prisoner did not suffer for a long period, roughly a minute, with this. It spread to many different lands. For example, in Czechoslovakia, they used a similar execution method and made adjustments, and at the end of the Second World War there were a number of high-profile war criminals who were executed in Czech lands using pole hanging. In Czechoslovakia they used a vertical pole similar in height, and the executioner sometimes used a ladder to stand on to perform the execution. When the prisoner jerked downwards, they would lose consciousness very quickly. It was used upon the notorious Nazi war criminal Karl Hermann Frank, who was executed in front of a number of people. He was lifted up to the top of the post by the sling and was dropped 2 feet, and the executioner covered his face with his hands. It was not just men who were executed in this way, as Milada Horakova, a woman, was executed by pole hanging for treason to the communist regime that emerged at the end of the war. Inside Czechoslovakia, pole hanging remained until 1954, and executions then moved inside of Pankrak prison. Hungary continued to use this method until it carried out its final execution in 1988, and the pole they used was shorter and narrower. It was similar in many ways, however the drop for the inmate was shorter and was tiny. The prisoners who were subjected to this were then hooded after they had died, and many of these executions were public. They were performed in front of large crowds. In Hungary, many members of the Arrow Cross Party, who were closely allied with Hitler during the war, were executed in this manner, and even prime ministers and leaders of the nation were condemned using pole or post hanging. Roughly 1,000 people were executed using pole hanging within Czechoslovakia, but this execution method did not catch on in other nations, such as Britain or the United States. These lands preferred to use the gallows and methods such as the long drop or the standard drop, but post hanging was used in Austria, Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and from the outside looking in, the execution method was rather brutal and ruthless, especially when performed in public, as the bodies of the victims were often left out for a while in the open, whilst death was confirmed, and the hooded victims on the post were terrifying, as it was clear what happened to them on the post. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.